Welcome to Sabs podcast. I'm your host, sabrinasalvati. Last week, I had the pleasure of attending a talk by Miko Peled at MIT. The talk was in reference to Israel and Gaza and the genocide taking place in Gaza. Miko Peled is an activist and an author. Most of you know him because of his book, The General's Son. So Miko is someone who has been on the other side. His father was a general in the IDF. It takes a tremendous amount of courage to do what Miko does, to come forward and speak out against the very forces that you may have once been a part of. So the talk that took place at MIT touched on several things. But one of the things that Miko made very clear is that we have to organize, we have to strategize to push back against the Zionist regime, to push back against some of these powerful organizations that are in place to keep things the way that they are, to keep the Palestinian people oppressed, to keep them occupied. I believe that we have to educate ourselves and continue in doing so, but we also have to continue to hit the streets. One of the ways that we can push forth this message is not just by educating people, but is also the media. We have to continue to push independent media. And this is not me just giving a shout out to myself, but everyone who is speaking out against this issue. It is incredibly important that we share these videos, that we share their articles so that we can continue to educate the masses. As it stands right now, the majority of Americans, according to polls, are not in favor with supporting a genocide of the Palestinian people. The problem that we are running into is that the mainstream media narrative is very, very powerful. But I think they are starting to lose control of that narrative. And I think that's because of all of you that have protested, all of you that have written articles about the history of Israel. I think we have to continue doing these things. So what you're going to see are a couple of moments from that talk at MIT. And I highly, highly ask you, please share this with everyone that you know.
And he was saying there's nothing you can't achieve with brains and courage. And that's precisely where you guys come in, the brains and courage. So keep on doing what you're doing. And I know I'm here for you, for anything you need, and there's a whole bunch of other people who are there for you. So use this as a resource. Anything you need, we're here for you. So thank you for that. Now, my background, I was born in Jerusalem to a very patriotic Israeli Zionist family. I wrote a book 10 years ago called The General's Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. And that book kind of propelled me into this life of activism. Until then, I had my career. I was kind of, dabbling in activism, but it wasn't something I did, certainly not like this, like I do now, which is all the time. And as the book title suggests, The General's Son, my father was a general in the Israeli army. And he was a general, and he served in the Israeli army at a very crucial period between 1948, when the State of Israel was established, and 1968, which is like, right after the 1967 war. And the generation of those officers in Israel are like the gods of the Olympus. They're considered, unbelievably heroic and so on. And I had other members of my family who were very much involved in the creation of the State of Israel. I have a grandfather who signed the Declaration of Independence of Israel and so on, and who were also held important positions in the State of Israel in the first few decades. So that was my background. And of course, when you're a kid and you see your dad as a general and all these important people, you think, wow, this is so cool. You're just so proud. And what's interesting is, I've been talking about this a lot lately. Growing up in that environment, at the time that I was growing up, the conversation the adults were always having were how do we contribute to the state? The state was the most important thing. It was kind of semi-fascist, really. State, the state, the state. You have to sacrifice for the state. You have to do things for the state. You have to, all that kind of fight for the state. So of course you think you're going to do the same thing as you grow up. And there are several things, as I look back, there were several things in my life that led to me ending up doing what I'm doing, which is, speaking out as clearly and as unequivocally as possible against Zionism and against the state of Israel. And it began, I think, with a story my mother told me, which I mentioned in the book. And she told me the story lots of times as I was growing up, and I never really understood why it was important until I wrote the book. And she was telling me, because when she was 22 years old and already a mother when, in 1948, during the ethnic cleansing campaign of Palestine, the beginning of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And she was born and raised and lived in Jerusalem, in West Jerusalem. And during that campaign of ethnic cleansing, the western side of Jerusalem was subjected to an absolute 100% ethnic cleansing. In other words, not a single Palestinian remained. Not a single Palestinian family remained, but the homes were there. And the communities, the neighborhoods, the Palestinian neighborhoods in West Jerusalem, they're still there. These beautiful, beautiful homes. And these were well-to-do, very prominent Jerusalemite families that lived there. And to this day, by the way, when people talk about these homes, they call them the Arab homes. And they usually have an inscription, and there's an olive tree and a lemon tree, and this is very typical, beautiful, stone houses. So she was already a mother. This was going on. These neighborhoods were cleansed, as they say, of Arabs. And she was offered one of these homes, being the wife of an officer and so on. And she refused. She said, how can I move to the home of another mother? How can I move my family to the home of a family that has now lost their home and they're refugees? And then she would talk about the looting that took place and kind of with a great sadness about the loss of these neighbors, these neighborhoods that were a part of Jerusalem that she knew. And she's a little demented now, so we don't talk much about these things anymore, but as I was working on the book and until a few years ago, we talked about this a lot. And I remember the story being told to me by her many, many times and by other people. It was something that I knew and I never really quite appreciated, but I did realize there was something problematic about the story. Because we're the good guys, so we don't kick people out of their homes. And we don't loot and steal. And yet she was telling, this personal story was contradicting this larger narrative that everybody in Israel, the Israelis learn about, and people here, by the way, also learn about. So her story was kind of unbelievable in a way. Unless you have the entire context, then you understand. And then what's very interesting to me is that when I tell the story, very often there's an older Palestinian in the audience that comes up to me later on and said, we had a home like that in Jerusalem. So thank your mother. And my point is, what she did was what you'd expect people to do. It shouldn't be unique. It shouldn't be considered exceptional. The fact that other people didn't do what she did is the problem. But when the bar is set so low, obviously if one person does the right thing, suddenly it seems like they're a saint. And she is a saint, don't get me wrong, she's a wonderful person. But that shouldn't be the measure. So that was one thing that kind of led me and was in my mind. Then, okay, I've never been occupied and I've never been oppressed. I never have. I'm a white Jewish guy. I've never experienced that in my life. I have very, very close people who are very close to me, who are like my family, who are Palestinians, who endure that every single day of their lives. Every single day, every moment of their lives. Actually, all Palestinians endure oppression and terrorism every single day of their lives. I have never have. So I could possibly comment on what they need to do in order to alleviate that horror from their lives. I can only support them, which I do. Now, what the Zionists and the supporters and these I don't want to use dirty language, inappropriate language, but the people in Congress who were discussing it, they try to narrow the conversation down to a single moment, ignoring completely where we live, completely ignoring where we are. So Palestinians have been enduring terrorism oppression of the worst kind every single day of their lives for, 3/4 of a century. Actually, before that, because they had to fight the British before that. But let's say, talk about the Zion, versus the, talk about the Zionist period. Palestinians do not have an army. They've never had an army. Palestinians never had a tank. Never. They've never had a warplane. Ever. They've never had anything even closely resembling an army. They've had small guerrilla groups, which can't compete with the military that Israel has. Israel has always, from the very beginning, had a massive, solid military. Which, if you've been, following my work, you know that I consider the Israeli military to be one of the best equipped, best trained, best fed, and certainly best financed terrorist organizations in the world. But because they have uniforms and generals and tanks, people don't talk about them as a terrorist organization, but that's what it is. Palestinians are, from time to time, now Palestinians have been resisting heroically for a very long time, but the vast majority of the Palestinian resistance has been unarmed resistance. Over the decades, the Palestinians have been enduring this since 1948 and before. The vast majority of Palestinian resistance has been unarmed, and the vast majority, by the way, of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, who Israel, of course, calls terrorists, have never heard, are political prisoners. Now, is it realistic to expect that a nation that has been so oppressed and on the receiving end of so much violence will never respond with arms? I mean, how stupid does anybody have to be to believe that that's possible? Now, maybe we get into that later, how Palestinians live in different parts of the country under different sets of laws and bureaucracies, but we know that over 2 million people live in the Gaza Strip, which is basically an open-air prison or concentration camp, or however you want to describe it. And the expectation that they would not respond to that and fight against it, even with the small, meager means that they have, is absolutely crazy. It's absurd. So to reject that and to condemn that is the height of hypocrisy. It's the worst kind of hypocrisy. To condemn oppressed people for fighting against the oppression is, and congratulate the oppressors as some kind of saviors and saints is the worst kind of hypocrisy. And what's even worse than that is the fact that people like members of Congress, but not only them, anyone you talk to, pretty much the administration and this establishment, support the oppressors and want to silence people who speak for the oppressed. And they know this. I don't think I'm saying anything here that is not known by people who are educated. At least, maybe not all, but generally speaking. It is estimated that there are that once the destruction ends and people start digging, that the number of casualties in the Gaza Strip over the last month or so will exceed 50,000 dead. 50,000 innocent civilian, I don't know if there are any such thing as non-innocent civilians, it's a funny thing to say. 50,000 people dead in about a month. In broad daylight, on prime time, with our money, our tax money, our weapons that are made in this country. And that's not the main thrust of the conversation? That is not what Congress is talking about now? That is not what elected politicians up and down, local all the way to national are discussing? How to end it? How to punish the oppressors? How to punish those who perpetuate this violence? How are they not talking about sanctions? How are they not talking about a no-fly zone over Gaza? How are they not talking about dismantling the apartheid state completely once and for all and safeguarding and demanding guarantees for the safety and security of Palestinians? How is that not the main thrust of the conversation? I don't know. I don't understand. So to condemn anything but the oppressor, to condemn anything but the people who are supporting the oppressor, to condemn anyone other than the people who are pretending and playing this game that the Zionists are forcing everybody to play, is ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. All of us in this room, everybody who has a heart and a brain to think, needs to condemn Israel and reject Zionism and demand the absolute, dismantling of the apartheid state as soon as humanly possible. Even Israeli generals were praising the abilities of these Palestinian fighters and how they were able to do this, and how they were able to train, and how they were able to put all this together. They came by air on gliders, they came by sea, they crossed, they walked across. I mean, it was a major operation. And it was very successful. Like it, don't like it, that's not the issue right now. And they managed to paralyze the state of Israel and expose what I actually believed was the case anyway, that the Israeli army is merely a paper tiger. The Israeli intelligence services are a complete fabrication, their enormous abilities. And that the state of Israel is, and the sense of security that Israelis had, and the sense of entitlement that they had within this structure. They're scared. They were terrified because everything fell apart. Now, the state of Israel, like any gangster that was humiliated, needed to take their revenge on something. They can't fight the Palestinians because the Palestinian fighters are better fighters. And we've seen this over and over again. So what did they do? And by the way, the Palestinian fighters are not an army. They don't have tanks or warplanes. We're talking about a bunch of guys in sweatpants and a semi-automatic, okay, with a limited number of bullets. So what do? They take it out on the weakest, most defenseless people they can find, which are civilians in Gaza. And that's how we end up with what today's count, like I said, the Palestinian Ministry of Health, kind of downplays the number, so there are about 20,000. It's expected to rise to about 50,000. But that's what they did. I mean, like a gangster, like a bully who has to take it out on someone. They went and they decided they're going to murder as many people as possible, just to show. While the fighting still goes on, in other words, that didn't affect the fighting that goes on, and Israeli soldiers are being killed during the fights too. So that hasn't solved anything, but they feel better about themselves. And the Israelis are pleased, and Netanyahu, the government feels good and strong, and so on. So the fact that we saw all this happen over the last month or so, month and a half, this presents us with an opportunity. Problem is, there's no parent to the Palestinian cause, so there's nobody to make demands. And even the best intentioned people today are accustomed, for some reason, when it comes to Palestinians, we should always request the very, very bare minimum and be grateful if we get half of that. That's the mentality. Ceasefire. Please, 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 ceasefire. The bare minimum. And then Israel agrees to a couple of days and then goes on bombarding again. And that is a massive failure, I think, on our part. This is an opportunity to say categorically that this vicious apartheid state has no legitimacy and must be dismantled and replaced with a free democratic Palestine from the river to the sea. This is the time. What more needs to happen? How much more cruelty, how much more brutality, how much more Palestinian blood needs to be spilled before people stand up and demand what Palestinians deserve? What more sacrifice do Palestinians need to show? What more courage Palestinians need to show? What more needs to happen before we stand up, and we have 500,000 people in Washington, D.C., demand dismantling the apartheid state now, not tomorrow, not next year, right now, and sanctions against the state of Israel right now, and a no-fly zone over Gaza right now, so not a single Palestinian, not a single Palestinian dies, not one more Palestinian killed. And instead, what are we talking about? Anti-Semitism, Zionism, not Zionism. Who gives a damn? Palestinians are being murdered everywhere, not in Gaza, only in Gaza, by the way, in the West Bank, in Jerusalem. Palestinian citizens of Israel are living a life of terror. What more needs to happen before these demands are being made? Now, there's no parent to the Palestinian cause. There's no state. There's no group of states. The struggle against apartheid in South Africa, the ANC, which was a force to be reckoned with, the South African Communist Party, the Soviet bloc, Cuba, who sent tanks to Angola. You know, Palestine has nobody. Nobody. It's not just the West, BRICS too, except for Brazil and South Africa a little bit. All the other BRICS countries are with Israel, and Africa and everybody else. We are the ones that have to do this. When we go out and demand, what is this? Who made this crazy decision to call for just ceasefire? What does that even mean? Look at the history of ceasefires. Israel has violated every ceasefire agreement it ever signed. What is this about ceasefire? Please, just so Israel makes things worse, the demand is for it to just pull back a little bit, and that's it. We forget how much worse, how bad it was, because now it's a little bit less worse. It's absurd. This is the time to demand that not a single Palestinian child be hurt anymore, ever again. There has to be a political resolution. There has to be a permanent political resolution to the question of Palestine that will guarantee, first of all, the safety and security of Palestinians, and then guarantee that this will never happen again, and guarantee freedom and justice for Palestinians, and guarantee the dismantling of the apartheid state and replacing it with a free, democratic Palestine with equal rights. And that is the recipe for peace. That is the only recipe for peace. Only a free, democratic Palestine with equal rights can lead to peace between Israelis and Palestinians. As long as the apartheid regime remains, there can't be peace, because the apartheid regime, or anybody who's what they call pro-Israel, all they want is privilege for Israelis at the expense of Palestinians. Israel never wanted peace. Peace has never been part of any strategic objective of the state of Israel, quite the opposite. And they made it very, very clear very early on. And even if they didn't say it, look at what they do. So peace has never been an objective. There can never be peace as long as this continues. This is nonsense. The only recipe for peace is, like I said, dismantling the apartheid regime and replacing it with a free, democratic Palestine with equal rights. Then peace between the two people is probably, I think, inevitable. But not to call for sanctions, not to call for a no-fly zone over Gaza, not to throw out every Israeli diplomatic mission back to where they came from, to allow Israel to participate in the Olympics and in academic arenas and cultural places. Are we out of our minds? And for an American politician to not be ashamed to associate themselves with Zionism, and we vote for them? What, are we crazy too? Why would anybody vote for a politician who is willing to associate themselves with this violent, racist ideology that produced these horrific crimes against humanity? So this is where we need to be. This is the conversation that we need to be having, and we need to be pushing this conversation in every arena, at every opportunity. Nothing less than that.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed those moments there from Miko. One thing that I do want to add is that I think it is very important that we understand that we are going to face tremendous opposition. Those of us that are fighting for the Palestinian people, we have to remember what happened to those who fought during the civil rights movement. We have to remember that this is not something that was won overnight. We have to remember that the civil rights movement lasted for quite some time. But in the end, the activists did win. Now, of course, there are other things that still need to be done in reference to civil rights in this country. But I think it is incredibly important that we understand there will be opposition. You have to realize again that these organizations are extremely powerful. Organizations like AIPAC, organizations like J Street, some of the politicians that are basically in the back pocket of those organizations. We have to understand that Ralph Nader made it very clear in his interview on Bad Faith Podcast that AIPAC owns the majority of Congress. So there is going to be a lot of pushback that we receive, but we have to continue fighting. We have to continue to fight for the Palestinian people, because I want you to think about it this way. Imagine if it were you. Imagine if it were you that were pulled out of your home, you that were forced to give up your land, you that were told that you could not return to your home, you that were being bombed, you that were losing all of your children. Well, you have to understand what is taking place right now in Gaza. This is an effort by the state of Israel and the Netanyahu administration to permanently erase not just the Palestinian people, but their culture. This is why they're bombing the schools. This is why they're bombing the hospitals. This is why they're killing the children. They want to prevent the next generation of Palestinian people. That speaks about Gaza. There is also the illegal occupation and settlements that are happening right now in the West Bank. So my prediction is that after Gaza, they will move forward to continue in the West Bank. We have to continue to fight for the Palestinian people. And at the end of the day, again, I want you to ask yourself, what if it were you? Thank you.